Donald Trump is on track to crush Kamala Harris in next month's election, and in this video, I'm going to tell you exactly why he is the clear favorite to win. The mainstream media is never going to tell you this. All they're going to do is point at some random state and say that Harris has a 1 or 2 point lead. But the fact is that Donald Trump is performing so much better than he did in 2020 against Joe Biden. The former president's performance has been extremely dominant against the vice president, who has run a horrendous campaign. And today, we're going to take a look at the 2024 electoral map based on the polling and compare it to what the polling said in 2020. And so on the map, I've filled in the relatively solid blue and red states and only left the 17 most competitive races blank. And when looking at the 2020 map compared to 2024, we can see a clear contrast. 4 years ago, Trump was struggling in seats like Missouri, South Carolina, and Alaska, 3 states that he's on track to win by much larger margins today. And in 2024, it's Kamala Harris that's struggling. She's barely winning in states like Washington, New York, and New Jersey, states that Biden won by 15 points or more in the last election. If you want another stark example, just look at Florida, a state where Trump leads today by 6%. But 4 years ago, the polling said he was going to lose the state entirely to Joe Biden by 0.9%. Coming back to the map, we're going to start out west and then slowly move our way east, beginning in Nevada, where Trump today trails Harris by 1.1%. But 4 years ago, he trailed Biden by 2.4%, and Nevada is not the best example of a stark difference between 2020 and 2024 polling, but it definitely does show Democrats were in a better position 4 years ago than they are today. Considering how close this election supposedly is, a 1% difference is quite significant. So Nevada is going to be tilt blue on our 2024 map, but it's only going to be lean blue on our 2020 map. And so when this map is all filled in, you'll really get a better visualization of the improvements that Trump has seen in his support from 2020 to today. Next up, in Arizona, Trump has taken a commanding 1.4% lead. He's also ahead in virtually every single poll released over the last month. And if you look at the graph, his lead has only been expanding over the past few weeks. Kamala Harris very narrowly took a small advantage in mid-August. She has since lost it very quickly, and Trump has been ahead ever since. His lead has generally been growing, and there's no doubt he is going to win Arizona this November. And so, it's going to be a tilt-red state. However, in 2020, the polling said Biden was going to win Arizona by nearly 1%. He was ahead by 0.9%, and so on our 2020 map, the state is actually going to be tilt blue. In Colorado and New Mexico, we simply don't have too much data, so you're going to have to take what I say with a grain of salt. Today, Colorado's on track to go to Harris by 11 points, according to the only poll. Now, this is a Democratic poll, so obviously it's overestimating support for the vice president, but nonetheless, it's the only data we have to work with right now. In 2020, Biden was supposed to win Colorado by 9.5%. He eventually won it by just over 13%. This is one of the very few examples where Biden actually outperformed polling. But again, these are only 2 polls conducted over a month before the elections. So you're going to have to take what I say with a huge grain of salt, like I said earlier. In New Mexico, we have a similar story. Simply not that much data. 2024 polls show Harris leading by 8.5%. Biden was leading by 13%. And so we have a huge drop-off for Harris from where Biden was 4 years ago. Still, both Colorado and New Mexico are going to be likely blue states in both of our maps. However, in Texas, we will find a stark contrast between polling today and polling from 4 years ago. Today's polls show Trump leading by 5.2%. He's easily going to win the Lone Star State for a 3rd time, but this was not the case back in 2020 when the polls had him winning by just 1.3%. In fact, Texas was basically a tie for most of the election cycle. Statistically, no candidate had an edge. Many people thought Joe Biden actually had a chance here. Ultimately, he lost Texas by nearly 6 points. Joe Biden was never actually going to win the state, but based on the polling, you would have thought that Texas was among the most competitive. And so this is one of those good examples of the polling being just so much better for Trump this time around compared to last time. Because in 2020, Texas was only a tilt-red state, while Texas today is going to lean for the GOP. And then moving up to the Midwest, this is going to be a pretty contentious region, especially the races in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. But we're going to start out in Minnesota, where Kamala Harris holds a 4.7% lead. This is okay. She is probably going to win Minnesota, but it's probably going to be closer than what the polling is saying. In 2020, Joe Biden was on track to win the state by 4.3%. He actually won it by 7.2%. This is one of those other very few examples where Biden outperformed polling expectations. But considering that Kamala Harris is running with Minnesota's literal governor, you would expect her to be performing better. So, on both of our maps, Minnesota is going to be lean blue, but Kamala Harris is not performing as well as she should want to. Moving on to Iowa. Today's polls have Trump leading by 4%. The state is going to be lean red, but obviously, Trump is going to win the state by at least double that margin. But 4 years ago, Iowa was also extremely competitive. The polling had him leading by just 2 points. In the end, though, he won the state by 4 times that margin. In fact, Joe Biden, for the majority of October, was the favorite in the state. But in the end, he lost it by nearly double digits. So the polling really overestimated Democratic support here. And that is going to be a trend we're going to see in many of its Midwestern neighbors. It really is in the Rust Belt where the polling gets it wrong the most. And unfortunately for Kamala Harris, it is the states in the upper Rust Belt that she must win if she wants to get to the White House. And then up in Wisconsin, this is a state Kamala Harris cannot lose. If Wisconsin goes red, the election is over. And it is my very strong opinion that Trump is going to be able to win back Wisconsin. The polling is looking very good for him. He only trails by 0.8%. You might look at this and say, why do I think Trump is going to win if he's not leading the polls? I mean, just look at 2020. Joe Biden led by 6.7%. Many polls had him leading by double-digit margins. Wisconsin was basically a lock for Joe Biden, and this was the consistent fact throughout the entirety of the 2020 election cycle. This was the reality 4 years ago. Joe Biden was going to dominate in Wisconsin, but in the end, he won the state by 0.63%. In fact, Joe Biden's margin in Wisconsin was smaller than Trump's margin against Clinton from 2016. And so today, Wisconsin polls show Kamala Harris on track to win by a tilt margin. But 4 years ago, they had Biden winning by a lean margin. It was very close to overcoming that 7-point threshold to even being a likely state. In neighboring Michigan, we have a similar story. In 2020, Joe Biden was supposed to win by 4.2%, but he only won the state by 2.8%. You might look at this and say that it's actually not that bad, but if you look at how the polling average changed in that final week, if you look at the polling from October 26th, Biden led by 9 points. But just 1 week later, on November 3rd, which is when the election was held, Trump had shot up to just being behind by 4.2%. And so, really, on the day of the election, yes, Trump's polling average was not abysmal. But just a few days before, he was on track to win the state by nearly double digits. The polling really did overestimate Democrats for virtually the entirety of the year 2020. Now, in 2024, Kamala Harris leads by 0.7%. Is it good that she's winning? You could argue that. However, Kamala Harris is not performing even close to as well as Biden was 4 years ago. And if she is winning by just 0.7% according to the polls, which generally have a leftist bias, she is not going to win the state. And so, Michigan will be tilt blue on our map, but just like Wisconsin, I very strongly feel that Trump is going to flip the Wolverine state back as well next month. And then on our 2020 map, the final polling average had Michigan as a lean blue state, but at many points, even just days before that, it was likely. We have another stark contrast between polling and reality from 2020 in the state of Ohio. Biden was supposed to lose the state by just 1%. In the end, he lost it by over 8 times that margin. In fact, Joe Biden was the favorite in Ohio throughout most of the election cycle, but in the end, he got absolutely demolished. In 2024, Trump does lead by 8%. He's probably going to be able to win the Buckeye State by 10 percentage points or more, considering just how inaccurate polls have been here in the past. And so, on our 2024 map, Ohio is obviously going to be likely red, but in 2020, it was only a tilt red state in favor of Trump, just like Iowa and Texas, which, as we all know, the former president won pretty easily. And then in Pennsylvania, this is the most important state on the map. It's very likely that whoever wins the Keystone State is going to win the election outright. And so looking at polling from 2020, it was actually pretty accurate. The final polling average got Biden's margin spot on, but go back just 1 month, go back to October of 2020, which is where we are in reference to the 2024 cycle today, and Biden was leading by 7 percentage points. Pennsylvania was supposed to be a lean blue state, but Trump surged in the final weeks. If he does that again against Kamala Harris, he is going to take a commanding lead. Harris is not leading by 7 points right now. In fact, she's not even leading. It says a tie right here, but if you look at the actual RCP map, you will see that Trump has a very marginal lead. Based on just how much he's been underestimated in the past, that is absolutely no problem. Pennsylvania is tilt red for Trump on our map today, but 4 years ago it was tilt for Biden, and then just weeks before the election, it was actually likely blue, just like both Michigan and Wisconsin, basically up until 1 week before Election Day. Up in the Northeast, we have New Hampshire and Maine, 2 states that really aren't going to be too influential. Kamala Harris is definitely the favorite in New Hampshire. Harris leads by 7.4% today. It's going to be likely blue, while in 2020, Joe Biden was ahead by 10%, so he was doing better, but it's still going to be likely for the Democrats. And then up in Maine, today's polling has the vice president up by 11.7%, but the University of New Hampshire is probably the worst pollster out there, so you really cannot take these numbers too seriously. Maine is also going to be likely for Harris. In 2020, Biden was ahead by around 12 points as well, so really, nothing too different. Another likely blue state. We do, however, see a much sharper contrast in Virginia. Biden was on track to win by 11 points in 2020. Today, Kamala Harris leads by just 6.4%, basically half of that margin. And this is not surprising. Virginia has been trending to the right. Harris is probably going to win the state by a lean margin. It's probably going to be decided by less than 5%. If Trump surges in the final polls, just like he's done in Michigan and Pennsylvania in the past, he might even have a chance at winning it. And if Joe Biden hadn't dropped out, Trump would probably be on track to win the state because before Biden left the race, Trump actually took the lead in the polling average against Joe Biden in Virginia. And so based on today's numbers, Virginia is going to be lean blue. However, in 2020, it was very firmly a likely state that Biden was on track to win by a double-digit margin. Next up in North Carolina, we have another case of Democrats crashing out right before the election. If you look at the polling, yes, it was relatively correct. Trump led by 0.2% in the polling average. He won the state by 1.3%. But just go back a few days, even a few weeks before the election, Biden was leading by 2 to 3%. At this point in the cycle, 4 years ago, in early to mid-October, it wasn't until basically the final day that Biden actually lost the lead. Now today, Trump already has the lead, so if he surges in those final few days, he's going to take a much more commanding lead. Trump leads by 0.6%. And so on both of our maps, the Tar Heel state is going to be tilt red. However, at this point, 4 years ago, of course, North Carolina was still a lean blue state, so we still do see a clear contrast between Trump's performance today and his performance against Biden. In Georgia, we have another one of those very rare states that underestimated support for Democrats in 2020. Biden won Georgia by 0.3%. The polling said Trump would win by 1%, so it was relatively inaccurate compared to many others. But today, Trump leads by 1.5%. He's leading by a larger margin than before. And again, just like in many of its neighbors, Georgia didn't become a red state according to the polling until the very end. Joe Biden actually led by quite a bit throughout most of the month of October leading up to the election. And so, on both of our maps, Georgia is going to be tilt red. But once again, we see that Trump is already in a dominant position, different from years in the past where he only took a lead at the very, very end. And then finally, in Florida, like we saw before, 2024 polls have Trump leading by 6%. He is going to dominate in the Sunshine State. There's no doubt he is going to win it. And then in 2020, the polls actually had Biden ahead. He was on track to win the state by just under 1%. So, on our 2020 map, Florida is going to be tilt blue. With both maps filled in, you can compare the 2024 to 2020 difference. Today, Trump is on track to win states like Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, many of which he was not going to win, according to data from 4 years ago. In fact, Florida was a blue state in 2020. Trump was only on track to win 221 electoral votes. Today, he's on track to win 281, although in all honesty, considering Kamala Harris's very weak margins in Nevada, Wisconsin, and Michigan, these are probably going to be red states in the next month. They're going to flip in favor of Trump, and he's probably going to win them when all the votes are counted in November. So, if you're ever worried about whether Trump can actually win this election, he is performing better than he ever has before, even compared to 2016 against Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump has never been so dominant in any of the 3 elections he's run in.